Okay, good afternoon and welcome to the Society for Wetland Scientists webinar. My name is Jeff Trulich and I'll be your moderator today. We have a pretty good turnout started up for today's event and I'm looking forward to announcing the topic and presenter for our December webinar later in the program. The SWS webinar program has proven to be a great addition to our member benefits list. We're excited about the opportunity to provide our members with a more great educational content as we move through the rest of this year and into next year. The general format of today's webinar will be a 40 to 45 minute presentation by our speakers, followed by approximately 15 minutes for questions and answers from the participants. Next slide, please. Okay, first some housekeeping items. Before we get started, just to familiarize you a little bit with the GoToMeeting screens, there's an attendee control panel on the right where you can control the audio for your webinar by using your telephone or microphone and speakers. And anytime during the presentation, you can type your questions into the questions pane. Our presenter will be answering questions at the end of the presentation. I want to note that all attendee phone lines are on mute to cut out background noises and distractions for our presenters. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording following the webinar. We'll also ask you to take a moment to complete the evaluation survey that will pop up at the end of the webinar. This will help us plan and analyze future events and how this one went. If you'd like the copy of today's slides, please find a PDF copy in the handouts part of that control pane. Please use hashtag SWSwebinar to tweet about today's webinar on Twitter. We love seeing what you have to say about the event. Let's test the questions pane and at the same time get a little demographic info by having everyone type the state of the country you are participating from and how many people are viewing the webinar with you. So if you could go to the questions panel on the right and try that. I see Arkansas, one person in Florida. So we've got some people chiming in on the questions pane. North Carolina, Maryland, Seattle. All right, great. Okay, with some of those logistics out of the way, let's get started with our webinar. Next slide, please. Okay, it's my pleasure to welcome today's presenters, Julia Cherry and Loretta Battaglia. Julia received her BS in biology from Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee in 1999 and her PhD in biological sciences at the University of Alabama in 2005. After completing a postdoc appointment at the USGS National Wetlands Research Center in Lafayette, Louisiana, Julia returned to the University of Alabama in 2006 as an assistant professor in the departments of biological sciences in New College. She has since been promoted to the rank of associate professor. Currently, her research is aimed at understanding the effects of climate change and other environmental impacts on wetlands in the southeastern United States. She serves as the SWS treasurer and the Ways and Means Committee co-chair. Our other presenter is Loretta Battaglia. Loretta is a community ecologist with over 25 years of experience working in wetlands. She received her BS in zoology in 1988 and her master's in biology in 1991 from the University of Louisiana at Monroe. She received her PhD in ecology from the University of Georgia in 1998. Following graduation, Loretta entered a postdoctoral position at Louisiana State University. In 2003, she accepted a tenure-track assistant professor position in the Department of Plant Biology at Southern Illinois University, where she was promoted to associate professor in 2009. She is interested in the dynamics of wetland plant communities and the ecological processes that link them with the surrounding landscape. Specifically, research in her lab focuses on the effects of climate change and exotic species invasions on community structure and function, as well as the development of restoration targets for coastal wetlands undergoing rapid climate change. Loretta's current projects include research on assistant migration and prescribed burning as management tools in coastal ecosystems threatened by climate change. She serves as the SWS Secretary General and the Membership Committee Chair. So welcome, Julia and Loretta, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to get started here talking about patterns of coastal plant communities and systems where we work. Coastal wetlands are ecological links between land and seas and thus function as important ecotones in the coastal landscape. The elevation gradient in these systems, albeit slight, about a 1 meter change in elevation from the water's edge into terrestrial communities, is really important because it underlies the more proximal gradients of salinity and flooding that strongly influence the plant species that live there. Flooding and salinity stresses really constrain species distributions and drive sharp turnover patterns and zonation in these systems. This figure illustrates changes in dominant species from salt marsh to brackish and into more upland assemblages, and is a real typical kind of pattern that we see along the Gulf Coast where Julia and I work. These communities provide very important ecosystem services in that they typically have very high primary productivity, which fuels these systems and often adjacent marine environments with detrital exports. Although the zones are generally narrow and the seaward ones are dominated by just a few stress-tolerant species, these landscapes have high biodiversity because the biodiversity accumulates as one moves perpendicular to the coast. The sharp zonation in plant communities gives rise to zonation of habitat as well, thereby providing important ecosystem services for other trophic levels and a wide array of economically and ecologically important species. In addition to providing habitat for many species, these coastal lands provide a number of other goods and services upon which humans depend. For instance, they abate storm impacts and stabilize shorelines, improve water quality, and sequester carbon because of their high net primary productivity, with MPP up to 0.18 petagrams of carbon per year, and also very high rates of carbon burial, with burial rates up to 87.3 trillion teragrams per year. See the graph at the bottom right part of the slide that shows a comparison of coastal marshes, mangroves, and seagrasses relative to forest on a per area basis.
Good afternoon. This is Julia now, and I'm going to continue by talking about the introduction material for our study today. And so as Loretta just described, these coastal ecosystems are incredibly valuable. However, they are increasingly vulnerable to loss from a variety of threats of both terrestrial and marine origins. So for instance, from the terrestrial end of the spectrum, hydrologic modifications in the landscape that alter water delivery, sediment delivery, or the delivery of nutrients and other chemicals can affect coastal ecosystems that exist as these ecotones in the landscape. Also, other land use and land cover changes, as well as freshwater and sediment delivery alterations, affect the amount of material coming to these coastal wetlands that allow them to adjust vertically and keep pace with sea level rise. So the bottom left panel here, which is taken from Weston Estuaries and Coast article from 2014, shows the coastal watersheds of the Atlantic and Gulf coasts of the United States. The different circles indicate the magnitude of either increase or decrease in sediment, suspended sediments delivered to the coast over time. The larger the circle, the greater increase or decrease. And what you see is that there are very few of the blue circles that indicate an increase in sediment delivery to the coast, but instead the majority of our coastal watersheds have seen a decline in suspended sediments delivered to the coast over time. When that is combined with threats from the marine end of the system, those combine to form sort of a double whammy for these coastal watersheds. For instance, sea level is rising, and the eustatic rate of sea level rise threatens these coastal watersheds with increased inundation. And we're also seeing some evidence of changes in tropical storm frequency and or intensity that can affect coastal ecosystems. In particular, for coastal wetlands, we're concerned with sea level rise and changes in storm surge or storm intensity. So when considering long-term resilience, sea level rise and tropical storms are of particular interest for these low-lying coastal ecosystems, particularly those in which we're studying along the Gulf Coast. Warming of the Earth's climate has contributed to sea level rise through a combination of thermal expansion and melting of land ice. And as you can see from the upper left graph, this is resulting in a trend of eustatic sea level rise of about 3.4 millimeters per year. In addition, warmer sea surface temperatures may also increase the frequency and or intensity of tropical storms, particularly in the North Atlantic and Gulf. As the figure on the bottom right shows, this is the power dissipation index that Emmanuel generated back in his 2005 Nature article. And what you see is that it's correlated with the rise in sea surface temperatures. So the solid line is sea surface temperatures, and the dashed line is the Atlantic Power Dissipation Index. And what we're seeing is the PDI is increasing over time in corresponding with increases in sea surface temperature, and this is resulting as a result of longer storm frequencies and more intense storms. So the combination of both sea level rise and changes in storm frequency and intensity increases the threat to these low-lying coastal areas that may become more inundated and see storm surges that penetrate further inland. With that in mind, it's important to consider how sea level rise and storm surges of increasing magnitude will affect the assemblages of coastal species and the ecosystems as a whole. So central question in our research is whether or not these ecosystems, particularly through the responses of the coastal plant species, will keep pace with these changes, and if so, how. So this animation will demonstrate what we're expecting these coastal systems to encounter as seas rise and these marshes become increasingly inundated. In some cases, however, marshes can keep pace with sea level rise through vertical accretion. So there is the capability of these marshes to keep pace with sea level rise through several mechanisms. In particular, there's a combination of both biological and physical or biophysical processes that contribute to surface elevation. So in this diagram, what you see, the surface elevation of the Marsh platform can be influenced positively by marine or riverine sediment inputs, as well as the accumulation of organic matter by the plants inhabiting these coastal ecosystems. However, the combination of the sedimentation and organic matter accumulation needs to be equal to or greater than that of relative sea level rise, so that of eustatic plus local land movement that may result in greater relative increases in flooding. And if the sedimentation and organic matter accumulation can keep pace with relative sea level rise, these systems can adjust vertically and persist in the landscape. The biological processes involved in here are incredibly important. There are valuable plant feedbacks to elevation maintenance. So in addition to trapping inorganic sediments, the production of the plants that inhabit these coastal zones can accumulate organic matter through high rates of productivity and the burial of that carbon, as well as the root zone expansion through high below ground productivity, as illustrated in the panel in the lower right. And what we've seen when we have been measuring elevation change in some of these coastal marshes along the Gulf Coast is that in some cases they can in fact keep pace with sea level rise through a combination of these biophysical processes. So in particular, what we've noted at some of our Louisiana sites is that there are periods of organic matter accumulation interspersed with pulses of sediment input through either flood events or marine incursions like tropical storms that alternate over time to allow these marshes to keep pace with sea level rise. Now it appears that the bottom of this particular graph is cut off. The x-axis is in months and the y-axis is the change in elevations since the baseline measurement, or time zero. And what this is showing is 10 years of elevation change in one of the coastal marshes that we've been monitoring since just prior to Hurricane Katrina. The darker red line with the square symbols, which I think you can see my mouse here, that is total elevation change. And what you see there is that the accretion, the orange line, actually exceeds that quite a bit. So in many cases, you can have sediment inputs that are quite high, but it may not be enough to offset sub-root zone subsidence or root zone collapse, as indicated by the yellow and green lines respectively, that result in losses in elevation. So it's the balance of these processes that are important for maintaining surface elevation. In this particular study, what we saw is two significant accretion events, the first associated with Hurricane Katrina, which resulted in almost 40 millimeters of sediment deposition on the Marsh surface, and that drove that initial gain in elevation. However, what you see with total elevation thereafter is that those sediments compacted and the subroot zone subsided, and the combination of those is that the elevation started to return back to baseline. But even after a few years, the sediment pulse from Hurricane Katrina was able to sustain these marshes. So with changes in sea level rise, coastal storm surges, and the feedbacks from the plants, we can see that these systems can in fact keep pace with sea level rise for some periods of time. And the plant feedbacks to elevation are very important in that they can also vary with the extent of flooding that they experience as well as the depth of sediment that they receive.
Where sea level rise is too rapid for species to keep pace in place and vertical resilience is lost, lateral or inland migration will be necessary for these species to persist in the coastal landscape. A somewhat optimistic model of inland migration is depicted in the top figure here, and it shows a typical conveyor belt kind of scenario where species are able to slide upslope at the same rates as other species in the transition to new, more suitable environments as the sea level rises. In reality, species are unlikely to be able to move at the same rates because migration may be hindered by persistent long-lived species, particularly woody ones that dominate in the upslope environments. The bottom picture here illustrates inland expansion of marsh, and you may be able to see right here, this is where the marsh has actually moved upslope. But note that it only happens where the forest is retreating. So here's the original forest line, and then here it is about 75 plus years later. So in this case, there's a coupling whereby the upslope assemblages lose resilience and ground, which appears to be necessary for marsh transgression to occur. In these dynamic environments, coastal species are responding and they're on the move. A recent study by Pollock and collaborators looked at this typical coastal transition gradient and temporal dynamics at Weeks Bay, Alabama, by delineating a series of historic aerial photography spanning 1940 to 2005. And it's important to note that during this study period, fire suppression was prevalent during that time and underlies some of the patterns that we can see through time. Here in these panels, the green part is upslope forest, the red is shrub forest ecotone, the fresh marsh is dominated by sawgrass or cladium and is shown in tan, and the olive and brown areas are salt and brackish marshes. And what we see over time is that the forest is extending seaward and out into the fresh marsh, at least in the absence of fire here, while the seaward marshes are moving upslope. These shifts have the combined effect of squeezing the fresh marsh zone. This type of coastal squeezing is not unique to Weeks Bay, and it's been reported in many coastal areas, and also includes some areas where there are more developed landscapes and land use changes that impede and also constrain upslope migration of species. So with every good squeeze, I like to say, comes a release. And we were fortunate enough to have permanent vegetation plots established at Weeks Bay that predate Hurricane Katrina, which occurred in 2005. These plots allowed us to study species responses to that disturbance in an area that we knew to be undergoing this coastal squeeze. During the hurricane, there was a storm surge that lasted for 3 days and enveloped the marsh and also extended up into the more terrestrial end of the gradient. This disturbance resulted in the die-off of a lot of the salt-intolerant vegetation, including many of the woody species upslope. Now, the two graphs shown here on this slide, there's the bottom part's cut off here, but that's 2006. These two graphs show two common species and their pre-hurricane curves, which are depicted in blue, and their post-hurricane distributions depicted with the green symbols along the coastal elevation gradient at Weeks Bay. So this would be close to the salt marsh and then moving up into the more terrestrial part of the gradient. And what we find is if we compare 2004 to 2006 distributions, we can see that these storm surges had the effect to contract these two species at their seaward end of their distribution. Whoops. So with the death of many woody, large-stature tree species in the upslope part of the gradient, these species that really shade out the understory and probably limit opportunities for a lot of the marsh species to expand upslope, with their death, we found that there were several downslope species, such as this seaside goldenrod here, and also the fresh marsh dominant sawgrass. These species took advantage of those opportunities and began to shift their distributions upslope of their pre-hurricane distributions, as you can see in comparing the blue versus the green curves. So these empirical data led us to think about restoration of coastal habitats and also ways to perhaps climate-proof these systems by putting perhaps species in locations that will be more environmentally suitable as the sea level rises. And so this led us to our first hypothesis for this research, is that downslope species can establish upslope, particularly if we override any potential dispersal limitation through assisted migration. Based on our findings at Weeks Bay, we also hypothesized that the establishment of these migrants may be enhanced when biological barriers, that is, big shade-producing, long-lived woody species, are removed. In this case, we are interested in reintroducing an important disturbance in this landscape that, unlike hurricanes, we can control the timing and the schedule of. And here we're talking about prescribed fire. So our study site is located at the Grand Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. Pardon me. Our study site is located at the Grand Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve along the northern Gulf of Mexico, just to the west of the Mississippi-Alabama border. Based on the nearest long-term tidal gauge, this area is experiencing an average sea level rise of approximately 3.3 millimeters per year.
To test our hypotheses at Grand Bay, we established a field study with two sets of plots spanning the coastal transition within the Grand Bay Marsh complex. The upper left map or figure here shows that we have a cluster of burn islands, so ones that were going to be treated with prescribed fire, and two sets of control islands. And by islands we mean pine islands that exist within an otherwise marsh complex. So if you look at the lower left, you see the control islands, which were adjacent to each other, and spanning the salt marsh up through the pine complex. Similarly, we have two burn islands that were treated with prescribed fire. Along this coastal transition from the salt marsh along the shore up into the pines, we have two sets of plots, one which we are referring to as as R plots, which is maybe slightly cut off on your screen. These are larger plots in which the only manipulation that they received was the fire, and they were generated for us to characterize the transition and the differences in hydrodaphic conditions, plant communities, as well as some ecosystem processes as you move from the salt marsh at the lowest elevation up through the brackish marsh into a fresh marsh ecotone and then into the pine island itself. And this transect spans about a 0.93 meter elevation gradient. We also established T-plots, which stood for transplant plots, which were smaller in size, and this is where we established a reciprocal transplant experiment in which we moved plots from one zone into another and vice versa, so that they were all moved into back into themselves or into the other zones. This allowed us to examine the hypothesis of assisted migration for those that were moved upslope, as well as giving us some insight into the resilience of the upslope communities that were moved downslope, so their resilience to sea level rise. To look at our design in a little bit more detail, with the 4 Pine Island complexes, again we have 2 that were burned and 2 that remain unburned. We had the 4 vegetation zones spanning that elevation gradient. This included the pine savanna at the upslope end of the extreme, the fresh marsh ecotone, the brackish marsh dominated by Juncus ramerianus, and the salt marsh dominated by Spartina alterniflora. Here you can see a bit of this transition on one of our islands. In the foreground you see a part of the salt marsh moving into the Juncus ramerianus brackish marsh, and then the shrub line along the pine boundary, and then into the pine island itself. The R plots, or the regeneration plots, were replicate 100 meter squared plots. We had 64 of them spread evenly across our 4 islands and across all 4 vegetation zones. We also established the T-plots, but first within those R plots, we characterized the transition. So I'll show you in a second the variables that we measured, but this was to characterize hydrodaphic conditions as well as the plant communities that naturally occur along these coastal transects, and some ecosystem processes that occur along these transects. In addition, we used it to monitor recovery on the burn islands after the fire. On the transplant plots, or T-plots, these were 1 meter squared plots. We had 64 of them evenly distributed across the islands and vegetation zones. This image to the right is showing one of those plots. What we did was we excavated sides of plant propagules and sediment from each of the zones and then assigned them to a new zone or back into itself, so a fully reciprocal transplant. The sides were excavated to 5 centimeter depth, bagged, tagged, and moved to their new location, and then replaced in the gap that was left from the excavation of the prior side. And then they were marked for further study over time. This was a full reciprocal transplant experiment, so again this allowed us to not only test the hypothesis of downslope species migrating upslope, but also allowed us, by moving upslope species downslope, to gauge the relative resilience of the species in those communities to increased flooding and or salinity. Here's an example of a few of our plots once they had had time to get established. On the left you see a sod that had been transplanted back into a Spartina alterniflora dominated salt marsh zone, and then on the other end of the extreme you see a sod, an example sod that was transplanted into a pine woodland habitat. The fire was prescribed in May of 2015 after we were able to conduct a community survey of the existing vegetation in our R plots. The fires were on the 2 burned islands again, and the controls were left undisturbed. Thereafter, we have been monitoring our suites of variables at least twice per year, and more frequently for community composition. And the measurements that we've been taking during those sampling events include aspects of the community structure as well as ecosystem level variables. So for example, we are documenting through percent cover measurements the changes in the plant community, as well as in our R plots harvesting biomass, above ground biomass and litter. And then we have installed root ingrowth bags that you can see in the image on the right that are used to measure below ground productivity. We also are collecting pore water to assess sulfide concentrations, salinity, and bioavailable nutrient concentrations, and sediment cores to examine characteristics like organic matter content, bulk density, water content, as well as extractable nutrients, both nitrogen and phosphorus. The sediment tiles that you see in the image on the right are used to measure relative sediment accumulation across the coastal transects in both our R and T plots. And we also have litter bags with compartments that are for above ground components as well as below ground. We're using a standard cellular substrate in those, and in this image here you see one of the upper compartments resting on the surface, and the below ground compartment is inserted vertically below ground. So this allows us to look at how the below ground carbon decomposes relative to litter on the surface. In addition, we are measuring canopy opening along the transects using fisheye photography. For today's presentation, we're going to focus on just a few of these. So those in bold or in darker font are the ones we'll present data for today. So that includes changes in the plant community, some above ground biomass and litter data, some of the pore water chemistry, and some of the sediment characteristics. And this is an ongoing study. We still have into next year to continue, at which point we will also have some of the ecosystem level processes of plant productivity, below ground productivity, and decomposition to add to the data set. So with regard to characterizing these transects, it's important to understand within the R plots, so those that were not transplanted into new locations, what the natural sort of environmental conditions of the system are. And from some of the pore water and sediment data that we have, just to characterize these sites, we're only able to get pore water from the marshes, so the salt marsh and the brackish marsh, but the salinities range from about 14 to 17 PSU and are actually kind of similar between the salt marsh, which is dominated by Spartina alterniflora, and the brackish marsh dominated by Juncus romerianus. In terms of sulfides, these are ranging in the 1 to 2 millimolar range, so slightly stressful for plants but not too much. And in terms of the soil moisture and organic matter gradient, what this figure is showing you is the elevation gradient from our salt marsh plots on the lower end up to the pine woodlands on the higher end, and this is in NAVD 88. The vertical lines are the upper limit of the plots from each of the 4 vegetation zones. So while there is some overlap in elevation as you transition from salt to brackish or brackish to fresh, etc., there is fairly distinct zonation in terms of elevation among these groups, as illustrated by those vertical lines. And in this data set, on the y-axis is organic matter, and this is based on the percentage of organic matter from loss on ignition. And what we see for both the control islands and the burn islands is that organic matter content tends to decline as you move from the salt, where there are waterlogged sediments, up to the pine woodland. And from the preliminary decay data that we do, we are seeing that decay at the salt marsh, especially below ground, is much slower than it is as you move up in woodland, waterlogging sediment, and you have enough soil moisture and access to oxygen to promote higher rates of decomposition. Similarly, when we look at the bioavailable nutrients, there's a bit of a gradient, although not significant for the control islands and highly variable, where we see changes in ammonium content. In this case, the graph is set up similarly to the previous one, in this case with ammonium concentrations per gram of dry weight of soil and on the Y. And for the control islands, it's more variable, and you have sites where there is much higher concentrations of ammonium. And in the burn islands, we see that there's a general gradient of an increasing concentration of ammonium as you move upslope. When we consider that pattern of generally an increase in elevation for the burn islands of ammonium concentration with an increase in elevation, we see the opposite when we look at phosphate. Phosphate concentrations are higher on both the control and the burn islands in the lower elevation salt and brackish marsh, and tend to decline as you increase in elevation through the fresh marsh and into the pine islands. So in this case, phosphate concentrations tend to decrease with increasing elevation. Now, in terms of characterizing these plots, the reason why this is important is when you consider that we're going to be moving things around, if there is a difference along the gradient, when we move the pine woodland with the propagules and the home soil environmental conditions, there may be a bit of a legacy effect when we move something that's perhaps low phosphate into an area that's high phosphate. And that might initially influence our transplant data. So in addition to these hydroedaphic conditions that we measured, we also examined the biomass gradients, so the above ground plant biomass and litter gradients that occur along this. And on this next graph, what we have along the x-axis are the control and burn plots on the lower left, the control and burn plots indicated by C and B respectively for each of the 4 vegetation zones from salt on the left up to the pine woodlands on the right, and the y-axis on the bottom left is for standing biomass. And these data were collected 1 growing season post-burn, so in the fall of 2015. The stacked bar graphs on the left are indicating the relative proportion of standing biomass that was live versus dead. Dead is in gray. And what we saw when we look at standing biomass is that fire did not have a significant effect on the live biomass. Instead, live biomass varied by zone, peaking in the brackish marsh. The brackish marsh live biomass was significantly higher than in the pine woodlands, with salt and fresh marsh as intermediate in terms of live biomass. There was a marginally significant interaction between the fire treatment and vegetation zones, where really the greatest effect of the fire on standing dead was observed in the brackish marsh, where you can see a decline there a significant decline there in terms of the proportion of standing biomass that was dead. So standing biomass peaked in the brackish marsh and tended to decline thereafter as you moved upslope. And again, this is just for the herbaceous species. We did not collect the woody species when you started to transition into those pine woodlands. So this is the herbaceous understory. When we look at the bottom right, we see the graph for just the litter that was on the surface of the marsh or pine island, and again oriented the same way here with the vegetation zones, but in this case there's a separate bar for the control versus the burn. Control without the stacking of live and dead. So here control is red and burn is gray. And for litter in terms of grams per meter squared, as expected, the amount of litter on the surface increased as you increase upslope, particularly when the pine islands, you had a lot of input of pine needles and cones. But the effect that the fire had was most obvious up at the upslope end of the extreme, where you did have all of that fuel, where the fire significantly reduced the amount of litter on the ground even after 1 growing season, and the effect of that fire diminished as you moved downslope. Now, as I mentioned before, the reasons it's important to characterize these effects, these hydroedaphic effects, as well as the differences in biomass along that gradient, is because when we start moving things around, that can give us some idea of what we might expect as we move more terrestrial ends of things down into the wetter ends of things, or vice versa. And so we are seeing a little bit of a legacy effect in some of the hydroedaphic variables, and what I'll point out here is just one, in this case for phosphate, where the reciprocal transplants are occurring among different zones, and they're maintaining some of the characteristics of their home zone once they've been transplanted into the new destination zone. So if you recall this graph from previously, this is the concentration of phosphate along the elevation gradient, and for both the control and the burn islands, it tended to decline. However, when we measured the same thing in our transplant plots, we see that this general gradient of declining phosphate concentrations with increasing elevation disappeared, and what we saw instead was no relationship. So this suggests that when we move a low phosphate pine woodland sod into a higher phosphate salt marsh environment, that it's taking a little bit of time for those sediments to change to reflect more of the destination zone than the home zone. And the implications of this help us interpret some of the data that Loretta will be presenting on community composition.
So assemblages in our naturally regenerating plots, so we're back to the R plots. can be used to make predictions about, as Julia said, how we expect the reciprocally transplanted communities to respond. So I just want to take a minute to look at some of these patterns in our naturally regenerating plots. The communities at Grand Bay near exhibit significant compositional turnover that very closely tracks salinity and flooding gradients, as we would expect. What I show here in this picture is a shot where you can tell the different zones. They sort of stick out with Spartina in the foreground, grading into Juncus, and then a very narrow fresh marsh zone here, and then a quick transition into the pine woodlands. The NMDS ordination that's on the right part of the slide can easily be interpreted even if you're not familiar with this type of analysis. Each dot represents one of our naturally regenerating plots, and dots closer together are more similar in composition than ones that are farther apart. And I've color-coded them by the zone that they occur in, and you can see in ordination space here changes from salt marsh communities depicted in dark blue, shifts over to brackish marsh in lighter blue, and then grading into this lighter green fresh marsh community and the darker green pine woodlands. There is somewhat more compositional mixing, by the way, between the fresh marsh and upslope pine woodlands, and the main difference here, they share a lot of species, there's a lot of overlap. The main difference is the presence of slash pine and a few other more common woody species in the more interior parts of the pine woodlands. Another key pattern that we see along this gradient is that diversity increases upslope as the salinity and flooding stresses are diminished. So when conducting our transplant experiments, we expected that, based on these patterns, that moving fresh marsh and woodland assemblages downslope would result in relatively low establishment, and ones that did establish might experience high mortality because those species aren't adapted to the stressful conditions. On the flip side, we expected when we moved seaward species, the salt and brackish marsh sods into the more interior upslope locations, that they would benefit from the stresses being reduced and may thrive even better in areas that had been burned because the biological barriers and shading, etc., have been relaxed. Now, this chart is a little bit complicated, but it's set up like the following three slides, so I'll spend a little bit more time on this one just to acquaint you with the layout. This table shows the average cover of the salt marsh dominant Spartina alterniflora, and when it's moved with its home sites from the salt marsh into its own zone, salt marsh, one zone upslope into the brackish, 2 zones upslope, and 3 zones upslope in the pine woodlands. It's also, let's see. I mean, I have to go back here. I apologize. I think there was a glitch with the clicking. Pardon me. So this is the Spartina alterniflora average cover data. Sorry. It shows the average cover over time, over 3 of our survey periods, when its sods are transplanted into salt marsh, brackish, fresh marsh, and pine woodlands. So in this case, the salt marsh dominant is transplanted in its own zone and 1, 2, and 3 zones upslope. The point to take away from this slide is that Spartina, although it establishes initially in the upslope extremes a bit, it only in fact persists over time in its own home zone and 1 zone upslope in the brackish marsh. Okay, now we're looking at salt marsh propagule sides, but the full community, and what is popping up in these, and what persisted by summer 2016. So this is our most recent survey. And you can see a whole suite of species that did establish in these salt marsh sides. And these are the destination zones where the sods ended up after we put the transplants in. One pattern to take away from this is that there was invasion of salt marsh sods when they were placed in upslope zones by a lot of species. In the downslope locations, there was very little establishment. In fact, juncus was the only one that established, and this was in brackish marsh conditions. So what this means is that any species like Spartina or juncus that may have established from these sods, when they're moved upslope, even if they persist, they're going to be increasingly interacting with other species that have invaded from the surrounding upslope communities. And so there may be some novel species interactions there, including competition with these upslope competitors. Here are some results for juncus, the brackish marsh dominant. And in this case, we moved sods from its home downslope into salt marsh, into its own zone, and then one zone and two zones upslope. Juncus actually does quite well if you look across that array of conditions in which it's been transplanted. It establishes and persists in both upslope positions and its own, and even survives downslope in the more stressful, abiotically challenging salt marsh location. In fact, juncus is really quite a champ and perhaps a good candidate for assisted migration. And in fact, we have found quite similar results in other transplant studies that we've conducted around the Gulf Coast. Juncus always seems to be very adaptive to a wide range of conditions. So species establishing from the brackish marsh sods were pretty scarce at the seaward end of the gradient, apart from Spartina popping up in the salt marsh area and a little bit of juncus disticulus in the brackish marsh. There is virtually nothing else. However, just like in the preceding slides, we're seeing a lot more establishment of upslope species when we move these brackish marsh sods upslope into those higher zones. And so this means that juncus and other brackish marsh species from the sods will have to increasingly interact more and more with these species from upslope environments. Right now it's really unclear how these interspecific interactions will play out, but we're monitoring that, seeing what the community dynamics will be like over time, and also what are the ecosystem consequences of those interactions. Now, in terms of the fire effects on some of the dominant species in the system, we're finding that, well, first of all, Spartina, we have to remember, is really quite sparse in Gulf Coast ecosystems like Grand Bay. It's different from the Atlantic coast where there are more expansive stands of Spartina. Here along the Gulf Coast, Spartina forms very, very narrow bands with a lot of times very sparse vegetation, and then this grades into much more extensive juncus stands. So it's sparse to begin with. Its cover is, as expected, highest in the salt marsh. And this area didn't really burn. The salt marsh, I mean, the fire was allowed to spread out across the Pine Marsh Island complexes, but as the tides were slightly in when the burn occurred, it acted as a natural fire break. So much of the Spartina zone did not actually burn. But what we do see is that in the brackish marsh, where Spartina establishes much higher in the unburned areas, leading us to the conclusion that Spartina is not a particularly fire-adapted species. Juncus, on the other hand, when we look at its cover patterns, we find significant differences, kind of expected, across our zones, where it's highest in its home brackish zone, a little bit less in salt marsh, and we find it less and less as we move up slope. However, it did occur in all four of our zones, so it's not strictly relegated to the brackish marsh area. It was also significantly higher in cover in the burn plots versus unburned plots, so it appears to like fire. Another important result that we're just now really coming to grips with is that although the fire was incredibly hot and very intense, and it appeared to kill most shrubs and tree saplings on the burn islands, these individuals have in fact rebounded, and many of the plots that contained these have higher cover of these species now than before the fire. And you may wonder, how can that be? It's because the fire killed the taller shrubs, but now they're resprouting from ground level, and they've really spread out over our plot, so the cover is actually higher. So in general, our work suggests at this point that coastal species are capable of shifting upslope, particularly when we aid them in doing so and help to overcome any potential dispersal limitation, which may be important, where a lot of our marsh species are in fact ones that reproduce vegetatively, primarily reproduce vegetatively. Also, we're seeing invasion by surrounding communities into sides that were transplanted and producing new species mixtures. And in these de novo mixtures, we're starting to look at interspecific interactions that are likely to include competition with some of the successful upslope migrants. At least temporarily, the fire-reduced abundance of upslope species, especially woody ones, which may initially at least benefit upslope migrants. However, this appears to be a relatively narrow window in time. And one takeaway from this, it's a little bit cut off on the bottom, is that the local resilience of upslope coastal assemblages may in fact prohibit the overall landscape resilience by thwarting migration of species that are under stress from rising sea levels. And therefore, periodic disturbances may in fact be necessary to maintain a more fluid seaward to landward corridor for species to move as the sea level rises.
So to conclude today's webinar, I mentioned earlier that this is an ongoing project, so we still have quite a bit to wrap up, and today's results are preliminary in suggesting that this assisted migration may work when fire or another tool is used to assist migration upslope. To continue this work, we're going to be completing the sequential sampling that will allow us to ultimately look at some of the ecosystem level processes of interest that are not only important for vertical resilience, but also may have implications for the functions of these new communities as they migrate upslope in response to rising seas. So we'll ultimately have data on above ground and below ground productivity, as well as decay rates over the 2 years post-burn. We'll be completing our post-burn community composition surveys, so the data that Loretta presented today will extend through the next season. And ultimately, we will be integrating these community data with the ecosystem data to see what the feedbacks are between the communities that are present and the environments in which they exist and the processes that we're measuring within them. We'll also be conducting some stakeholder workshops, one of which is to promote fire as a management tool for the managers that are tasked with conserving these coastal landscapes along the northern Gulf of Mexico, and also one to promote the education of coastal marsh ecology, and in this case, the various variables that we're measuring as a part of this study. And in conclusion, we would just like to thank the many student field assistants from both Illinois SIU and Alabama who helped with the field and lab analyses, our collaborators at the Grand Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, including Mark Woodry, and a collaborator at Argonne, Pamela Weisenhorn, who is looking at some of the microbial data that was mentioned in our measurement list. We'd like to thank the funding that was provided by the EPA through a grant to the Gulf of Mexico Foundation and our partnership with the Grand Bay NER. And with that, I think we have a few minutes for questions. If we'll turn it back over to Jeff.
All right, thank you, Julia and Loretta. That was good research you're doing, and a good laydown of all the efforts you have going on to look at prescribed fire. So we appreciate that. I can't see the questions box, so if people have questions, if they could put it in the chat box, if that's available, that would be good. Or if one of the SWS staff folks can see it. Mine closed and I can't see it, but I do have a couple of questions real quick that we got in. Let me see if I can find them here. Did you see in any of your research how frequent fires should be in order to encourage this upslope migration and a long-term survival and make it a sustainable managed retreat of the system over time? Does that depend on any other factors like sea level rises in a region or whatnot? Or is there an optimal pattern that people should get into if they are managing a system like this?
I'd like to address that briefly, Jeff. I think it's actually a good research question because there's really not a lot known about this. So I could just punt and say that, but what we do know is that in the southeastern pine-dominated pine savannas, that fire was a frequent disturbance and probably occurred every 2 to 3 years. We're not sure if that applies strictly to these maritime pine islands that are surrounded by marsh, so they may not have had quite as frequent fire. What we are seeing, however, though, is that the sprouting that's occurring, I mean, it's happening, less than 2 years following our prescribed burn, and it's going to increasingly limit herbaceous species abundances in those systems. So Grand Bay is planning another fire to sort of test some of these fire frequency questions once Julia and I are completed making our measurements next year. So we'll have more information about that going forward.
Okay, and when you got another question, what scales did you see that were feasible, for logistics and impacts and surrounding landscape, if there's, humans nearby or roadways or infrastructure, what scales do you think are feasible to use this as a management tool? Are there small scale only, or can you manage this on a large scale like a wildlife refuge or something?
Do you want to take that one, Julia?
Sure. So, of course, anytime anybody wants to do a prescribed fire, there's certain considerations, not only with regard to the conditions in which the fire will be lit, but also the surrounding human communities and what the risk would be to them. So we were looking for winds that are going to blow the fire out, etc. In terms of scale, that means if you're in highly developed areas, the fires may have to be small in nature, or in some cases may not even be possible. It also depends on who the landowners are as well. At the NER, we have state and federally owned land that we were able to burn on at a relatively large scale within those complexes. In terms of where it would be useful for assisted migration, I think it's important to consider what sorts of barriers you're trying to address. So in these systems where you have these natural barriers along a more slight elevation gradient, where you don't also have a topographic barrier to upslope migration or a sharp topographic barrier to assisted migration, then fire might be a very good candidate to help reduce that woody cover. An interesting study that was published earlier this summer by Nick Enright and others from what is now the Wetland and Aquatic Research Center in Lafayette was actually looking at the entire northern Gulf of Mexico coast for candidate areas where migration is possible, and suggests that their analysis suggests that there are places where inland migration with rising seas there's plenty of space for it, and it of course is outside of those urban corridors. But in those cases, those might help not only prioritize areas to try to conserve into the future to deal with sea level rise, but also areas where fire might be a good candidate to assist with that migration. So the scale and the scope of it certainly would be determined by the type of barrier you have, and then what kind of logistical constraints you have to starting the fire in the first place.
I'd like to add something briefly about that in terms of the scale of these assisted migration efforts in particular, is that this was a very laborious kind of experiment to lay out, and it's still it's really small scale, 1 square meter plots. Scaling that up would be a really onerous and probably impossible task for a lot of reasons. But there are ways I think that it can be used maybe to kind of seed the landscape, provide these more local seed sources into upslope habitats, and then I think also maybe taking a little bit less laborious approach to it by using you know, seed broadcast kinds of techniques might be one way to make it more feasible to apply it on a larger scale. I think these experiments, what they do is they help us understand what's possible biologically, and then we can go from there to develop the actual technical approach.
And just to follow up again on that, one of the things that we had talked about, because it was a laborious process to physically move these propagules, but the fire might also promote natural dispersal more effectively if you remove that, and in this question slide you could actually see it, that shrub barrier right at the ecotone between marsh and pine woodland, that if the fire knocks that back and then you do have some sort of overwash event, it will help disperse those propagules further inland into the pine island than they would otherwise, because what we have seen when these areas that have been fire suppressed are hit by a storm is that the surge might penetrate over into the pine island, but the rack and all of the propagules, most of them accumulate right along that shrub line. So the fire could knock back that barrier, and then in the event that there's a natural overwash, help promote upslope dispersal more effectively. And that would be sort of the lowest, more passive end of that sort of assisted migration approach.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. If I could get the next slide up to push our next webinar in December. Please mark your calendars for the next webinar in this series. It's December 15th. It'll be at 1 p.m. East Coast time in the U.S. We're always looking for new presenters and new topics, so if you're interested, let the SWS headquarters folks know. Our next webinar is Life in the Mud, Relevance of Food Security, Climate Change, and Water Quality by Dr. Reddy, who's a research professor at University of Florida. So tune in for that one in the middle of December. And the last slide is our big contest. Help make the annual meeting a success by sponsoring different sponsorship levels, I'm sorry, in the annual meeting that's coming up in Puerto Rico next June. We have a contest that's called Name the Frog. You can get all the glory of naming this frog, which is our logo for that event, and win a $25 Amazon gift card. So use hashtag Name the Frog, and you can tweet or you can comment on the SWS Facebook page. And you can walk away with all the glory of naming the frog. There's several different things going on in that event. We have a silent auction put on behalf of the South Atlantic chapter, who's the host chapter. That'll help, some of the proceeds will help some of their initiatives, including supporting students in wetland science. Members and friends of Wetland Science community are invited to donate an item or service by completing the donation form on the annual meeting silent auction page by May 1st. And so with that, I will encourage you to hit that page and check out the Puerto Rico meeting and start looking for some of the abstract submission information and symposia on that page. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody and our presenters today for the great information.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks, everyone.